an overall presentation of the FABLE team's work led by Aline Mosnier. And then we're going to give you a sneak peek at some of the work of 3 of the country teams. We're going to start with the Nordic region, then we're going to move down to Mexico, and then we'll come back to the United Kingdom. There's 2 things that I'd like you to take away, at least 2 things I'd like you to take away from these presentations. One is the modeling work of these communities in terms of testing out these pathways. But as important, if not more importantly, the objective of the FABLE team is to provide a tool by which countries can begin to develop pathways. And so the narratives, the transition narratives that originate from these countries that the modeling teams are taking on and trying to understand really are shifting, I think, the way that we do research, away from research, put your papers on a shelf and hope that policy takes it up, to a really much more integrated and iterative relationship between the scientific community and the policy community as we seek to try to understand what options we have to achieve sustainability, equity, and health by 2030. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aline in just a minute. We'll have her presentation, the 3 country team presentations, and then we're going to have ample time for conversation and discussion, where I strongly encourage all of you to please submit some questions. This really is a session that we have for you to get to know the FABLE team, to get to know the FABLE tools. Do put your questions in the chat, and we will make them available to the teams. And we really hope that the second part of the program will be about those questions and those responses that you have. So with that, welcome. And let's turn it over to Aline for the first part of the presentation.
Hi, and thank you, Fabrice, for the nice introduction. So I'm going now to introduce the work that we are doing in FABLE. And then, as Fabrice mentioned, the colleagues will present more on the country perspective. So FABLE wants to look and to try to see how we could solve multiple problems that we have on the food and land use systems. These problems are urgent. So we have on one side the climatic problem. We had the recent estimates from the World Meteorological Organization. We just showed that in 2019, the GHG concentration reached the new highs, and the last decade is the warmest on record. So this is also the source of more frequent extreme climate events. And we have seen that this year with the number of fires around the world. We have also a biodiversity challenge. An average of 25% of species in assessed animal and plant groups are threatened, and around 1 million species already face extinction, according to the IPBES report in 2019. And we also have a challenge for equity, and in order to have the population, all the population, to meet the food security, to have access to a healthy and nutritious food. And we still have 2 billion people who do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food in 2019. So this is still a big topic on our agenda. When we look at also the land degradation and desertification issues, we see that human drivers are causing deforestation, forest degradation, erosion of agricultural soils, and so on. And behind that, agriculture is a key driver of all these changes. But also, of course, a lot of solutions then sits in the agricultural sector. So in FABLE, we want to have an integrated approach. We think that all these issues are connected, and so we cannot look at one problem in isolation from the others, and especially when we want to see what would be the solutions to change the system, to transform the system towards more sustainability, we need to include all that into the same framework. Why do we need a consortium? First of all, because previously a lot of assessments have been at the global level and they were extremely useful. But since most of the decisions are taken at the national or even subnational levels, in order to really feed into the policy processes, we really need to have scientists who use this integrated approach at the national level. They can interact closely with the policymakers, they know the context better. So this is also why we started FABLE, to have in each country a team of scientists who can work closely with the policymakers. Then also, the land and food systems are interconnected. So one country can hardly think in isolation from the others. We have international trade happening. So decisions in order to increase our sustainability into one country has also to be assessed in the international context. So what are the spillover effects? What are the impacts on the other countries? Another aspect of the consortium, another value of it is to allow the countries to share experience and find better solutions. So we have currently 20 country teams represented in the FABLE Consortium. In some of these countries, we have also FABLE platform. As you know, FABLE is part of the Food and Land Use Coalition. So in these countries with over FABLE partners, we have a dedicated team who really look also at all the different dimensions of these problems. What do we propose in FABLE? So one of the key elements is this globally consistent long-term national pathways. We have the national teams and we transfer them if they do not have already some tools in order to do this integrated assessment by mid-century of the different targets related to food and land use systems. So first of all, we define what are the global targets regarding biodiversity, food security, water, phosphorus and nitrogen use, and also food security. And then we develop the tools at the national level in order to represent all these aspects in the national context. So it relies on a database, right, collecting all the relevant data regarding this topic, then building the tools, so the modeling tools, there are quantitative models. Also, some scrutinize the results from this model, improve them if necessary, and especially ask for feedback and also what are the big questions from national stakeholders. So what are their policy objectives and what are the objectives at the national level which have to be taken into account besides the global targets. These national pathways after are aggregated to the global level, and two things happen. One, we solve trade, because if all the countries make their own assumptions on the export and imports at the global level, it might not sum up. So we have another iteration where we harmonize trade and take into account what have been the assumptions from other countries at the domestic level. And the second part is a bit a process where countries are encouraged to raise the level of ambition to meet the global targets. So we compare what are our achievements in each iteration with our global targets, and then try to revise and improve if necessary in order to meet these targets. This is what we call the Semitone. This is something that we have started now 2 years ago, and we try to always improve this process. But this is something so mixed between scenarios and marathons. So they are usually quite intensive and with very dedicated times for that. This is how we call it, Semitones. Then, so I'm going to present a bit what has been our 2020 Semitone and some global results. So this 2020 Semitone, we defined 2 or 3 pathways this year, like representing alternative ambition on the political side to reach greater sustainability of the food and land use systems. So we have one which is more on the lower boundary of the ambition and one at the higher bound. Some countries have defined a middle one. I think that the UK team is going to present a third one. Then we also use this year two types of models depending on the country. So we have for most of the countries a FABLE calculator, an Excel tool, which has been developed for FABLE, but which is also open and can be used by others who are interested. And the MACPI model, which is a partial equilibrium model developed at PEAK and which has been used by the Indian team. So this is also to show that within FABLE, we are not using only one type of model. Most important is that like a tool can represent all the domains that we want to cover and the targets. But then we welcome very much the participation of different tools and different modeling approaches. So we had 20 countries participating and 6 rest of the world regions in order to close the global balance. And these pathways have been computed until 2050, and we had about four different iterations. We played with a subset of the FABLE targets, global targets. So this year we had food security. This one is a target which has to be met in each country. So we need to have the average national calorie consumption, which is above the average minimum daily energy requirement in all countries by 2030. For land and biodiversity, we have 3 targets. One is zero net deforestation by 2030, and the other one is related to the evolution of land where natural processes predominate, so to capture more bit like the risk for biodiversity. So one is a no-net loss of this land by 2030 at the global level, and the other one is an increase of at least 20% by 2050. And these are aligned with this new biodiversity targets. Then on the GHG emissions, these targets rely on the literature review, and so these are values which should be consistent with the climate agreement from Paris. So we would have a maximum of 4 gigaton emissions per year from agriculture and 0 or net or like negative or 0 emissions from the land use change sector. On the freshwater use, we have also a limit on the global consumptive blue water use, irrigation water use by 2050. But also for this one, we have, like according to the literature, also we have quite a wide range, and we are also playing with this target for the first time this year. So our results are really a first step. So each country, I'm sorry, this is a lot of information in this figure. I don't want to go into the details to all of these numbers, but just to show you a bit what it means, a pathways for FABLE. So we have a set of parameters that we can change in our models. And each country is free to choose the combination of parameters value that he wants, or that is reflects the best the national context. So population, of course, is a big driver of the future of food and land use systems, but also the dietary change, the productivity assumption, both on the crops, livestock, and even for livestock, there is a component which is really on the ruminant density for the pasture area. There are also assumptions regarding trade, the evolution of exports and imports, biofuels, afforestation, and also things which do not appear here, like food loss and waste, but also a constraint on the land use expansion. What we can see is that in the sustainable pathway, we tend to have a lower global population and also a reduction in calorie consumption in many countries, even though in some countries where the current consumption per capita is low, the sustainable pathway would mean higher consumption. So also here, this is important to differentiate depending on the starting point of each country. Our country teams also have assumed higher crop and livestock productivity in general in the sustainable pathway. For exports, it's not always what we think. Sometimes people say that most of the countries would then reduce exports and increase their imports in order to meet sustainability domestically and then export the negative impacts outside. But what we see from the country teams that we have, they didn't want to reduce their exports. To the contrary, they thought that even in the higher sustainability scenario, they could even increase their exports because they implement other measures that would still allow to increase the overall sustainability of the system. Also, a lot of progress for afforestation was assumed under the sustainable pathway, and also most of the countries have implemented some reduction of the food loss and waste. Of course, there are some limitations in our framework, so some of the solutions to reach greater sustainability are not represented, so it doesn't mean that they are not important, it's just that our modeling tools currently, we are not able to represent them, and this is, of course, some area for improvement in the future. So this is, for example, the case of the representation of specific management system like organic farming, or also agroforestry or agroecology. I'm just going to show you some few results. One on the land side. So in the current trend pathway, which is a bit the lower boundary of our scenarios, we have some increase of the cropland and pasture area globally, which results in a reduction of our natural land, so forest and over natural land, and also reduction of land for biodiversity. What I think is interesting is that in this scenario, more than 45% of the total agricultural expansion, so both pasture and cropland, between 2010 and 2030 would be driven by higher consumption of livestock products, because a significant share of the cropland expansion would be driven by higher demand for animal feed. Then in the sustainable pathway, we have significant changes regarding the land composition. Cropland and pasture begins to reduce, to shrink already after 2020, so very, very soon for pasture. And this is, the dietary shifts plays a big role also here. One aspect is that the dietary shifts would lead to significant changes in the global composition of cropland that we would probably need to prepare soon for that. So for instance, like corn, which is one of the most widely grown crop globally, the total planted area would be lower than in 2050, but what is currently the case, because especially we would have less demand for animal feed. On the other hand, we would have a significant increase in area dedicated to nuts and pulses, and this also will need to be prepared in advance, especially for nuts, in order to avoid large increase on the price and ensure the affordability of the healthy diets in the future. On the global forest cover change results, I think that this is also an interesting one, because this is one of the most contrasted results across our pathways, like showing that the achievement of our target by 2030 is not so easy. And in one case, so in our current trend pathway, we have still a depth. We have 15 million net losses of forest, but in the other cases we have 15 million gains. So we can really see how the different policies which can be implemented make a change on the future deforestation, and also like how urgent would be the implementation of these policies to avoid this peak of deforestation, which is expected to be in the next decade, not at the end of the mid-century. So there is really some urgency to put in place these measures. These measures, they were mostly zero deforestation, so preventing any forest conversion for agriculture in some key countries like Brazil or Indonesia, and also ambitious afforestation targets in also large countries, Brazil, US, India, Australia, and also Ethiopia. And finally, the last point is some productivity increase, but combined with a lower demand due to the territory shifts. And in total, so this would avoid the destruction of 84 million hectares of forest, which is quite significant. Then another result is on the global GHG emissions from the agriculture and land use sectors. In the current trend, also this is not met. This target is not met by far. We have emissions which are 80% higher than our target. So this is quite a significant risk also to miss this target. So countries need to substantially increase their current efforts, also act fast on that. What also we show is that 5 countries are key to reduce global FABLE GHG emissions, and without any surprise, they are the big countries where we have like a big population, but also the countries where we have large share of the tropical forests, Brazil and Indonesia, for instance. What is good is that, like, at least the recent announcements from the Chinese president about the carbon neutrality by 2060, or the change now from the US policy and the fact that they would come back to the Paris Agreement, shows that these measures can make a big change and really can put our global emissions on a completely different track, so and on a good track. Also, some limitations with our study. We do not take into account some mitigation potential from the forestry sector that we do not represent yet in our model. So there could be also some additional mitigation potential from there, and also from specific mitigation technologies in agriculture. These are not represented, so maybe also we are a bit pessimistic here, and we can have a hope to have even bigger cuts in emissions in the future in our sustainable scenario. So the next steps now for the FABLE Consortium. So one thing is to allow more people to use our modeling tools. I think we have seen that by working with these models, we understand better. We understand better how things are connected, the complexity of it also. But that's really a very good tool to learn, and also to find sustainable solutions together. So if we are more people allowed to interact with such tools or around these tools, so that could be also something just to feed the debate, to launch the debate during some stakeholder workshop. It's not always the final results which are interesting, but these tools allow to also bring the discussion into, I think, a constructive way. Another aspect is that we will have some work to continue to improve our pathway. So as I have mentioned before, currently we are not taking into account some land sharing management. So there is some potential to increase also biodiversity, for example, on agricultural land, and to have a mixed system which can deliver on multiple targets on the same area. So this we would like to take into account. Then also there are the socioeconomic dimensions, poverty, inequalities, that can make quite a big difference also on the achievement of our food security targets at the global level. So we think that we should also take that into account in the future. And also going more to the subnational level. This is especially important in big countries, but also in countries where which are very decentralized and where the decision is made at a subnational level. And finally, we would like to link more with policies. So there is a new initiative which is called FABLE, and we will try to do the like as a climate action tracker did, but really focusing on the FABLE sector, And of course, this will be also of great value for our modeling work, because once we know better which policies are envisaged or will be in place, we can then model better also what would be the consequences of these policies, and also show potentially also what would be the unintended consequences of these policies, which are not always easy for policymakers to see. So if, of course, I would invite you to have a look at our report that we have just launched yesterday. So this was a great collective effort where you can find also like all the country chapters, the 20 countries results for their specific pathway. We have also like all these results that I've shown, but also for specific countries or online. And you can also download the data there on our dashboard. Then, of course, like we have 3 models that we use in general in FABLE for now, for the time being: the FABLE calculator, MagPie, and Globiome. Also, I encourage you to look for this for more information on them. And also the FABLE website, as I mentioned, FABLE is part of the FABLE coalition. There are a lot of great reports there by all our partners. So please have a look. And in case you would like to have more information, there is also a contact point for FABLE. And now I'm very happy that that Ingo is going to talk, right? Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Aline. And I think it's quite promising that we show that the collective effort of countries can actually bend quite a few of the curves that we're concerned about. And I think we're also convinced that with some additional effort, that there's even more a change that we can impact. We're going to turn it over to Ingo, who's going to represent the Nordic team right now for a quick presentation of what that country's results are. And Ingo will also talk about their stakeholder dialogue process. I want to thank all of you who've been submitting questions. Please do keep them coming. And those of you on the FABLE team, if there's questions that you want to answer in the chat, in the Q&A forum, please do. But we'll also come back to those during the virtual or the vocal question and answer period later on. But yeah, keep those questions coming, and I encourage the FABLE team to take a look at those. Ingo, it's great to have you. Over to you.
Yeah. Oops. Sorry. Hope you can see this?
We can see it, Ingo. If you want to just click on your full screen mode, and we'll...
Right. Like this? Good. So yeah, hello everybody. My name is Ingo Fetzer, and together with Shyam Basnet, I'm going... And on behalf actually of the whole Nordics FABLE team, I'm going to present you the pathways for sustainable food and land use systems from kind of a Swedish perspective. So when it comes to transforming to sustainable food systems, we kind of identified what we call the big 4, which is the first one is kind of the environment, which not only includes kind of biodiversity, but also kind of intensity of or how land is actually used. The other thing is kind of course, is the diet, and that includes kind of the healthy diet. But a healthy diet is not only its composition, but also the like let's say the excess of a calorie intake, so that this also has to be within a certain limits. Another aspect of a sustainable food system is kind of that it has a kind of a low global footprint. That means that you not only contribute through, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions to kind of the general climate change, but also that you don't externalize your problems to other countries. So, for example, I mean, in the Swedish context, is that like 60% of all food that's produced in Sweden is actually...
Ingo, I just want to interrupt you for a second. If you switch slides, we have not seen the slide change on our screens.
Okay, just maybe I'm sharing the wrong... If I change now, do you see this?
Yeah, that's working. Thank you.
Okay, good. Sorry, sorry for that. So Yeah, well, the global footprint. So that also means that you're you can be very sustainable within your country, but actually you're kind of very unsustainable through that these imports. So that means a sustainable food system should be based on a more local food production and also provide some self-sufficiency. So the first thing what we did, or what one should do, is kind of analyze the system. So we looked at the current diets of the Nordic countries. So what you see here in these bars are kind of the diets for these different dietary sectors here from the different countries. So each color is one country, and the green ones is actually the kind of the range of recommendation. And what you can see is here, I mean, we are kind of in mostly somehow in the recommendation area. But I mean, when it comes to kind of red meat, there, I mean, all of the Nordic countries are way off what is actually recommended. The other critical aspect is kind of legumes and nuts, where we're also kind of far too low. One could also argue that, I don't know, we could actually improve on vegetables. But anyway, so we've learned now from just looking at that is that we definitely need, for kind of in a sustainable scenario, decrease our red meat consumption and increase actually legumes and nuts consumption. The next thing is also what we looked at is, so what is actually our impact, our global impact or environmental impact on so what you see here is now kind of the per capita planetary boundary share of the Swedish food system is actually, so this is kind of the boundary limits. That means if you're out of it, then you're kind of transgressing it. And as you can see here is actually that the Swedish food system at least kind of transgresses almost all of the boundaries. So based on all this information we have, we created these type of scenarios which allows us kind of to investigate current trends, but also kind of look at options. So, and this is Aline already said, like, so we looked at the current trend. We used some assumptions for the future. So in this case, the shared socioeconomic pathways that were set up. We used kind of a middle of the road scenario. It's kind of a balanced one, but we also integrated some of the political goals that were in there, which is a 10% reduction to 2015 when it comes to food waste. But I mean, other ones, so when it comes to biodiversity hold or land afforestation, so that there are no political incentives right now to kind of, increase those. For the sustainable pathways, we changed some of these aspects. So one of these is this reduction of red meat, but then also kind of we try to halt biodiversity loss by reaching the IG targets up to 2013, so included them, but also added some afforestation. Next to that, we also had a sustainable plus, so a more or very ambitious pathway scenario that we included in the scenarios, which is kind of, has some of the aspects even more, stronger. So we did this just to see what are the options if you're really ambitious. Anyway, so when it comes to kind of the composition of the food diet, we already know, so we have to change this slightly, so decrease the red meat. And so when we change to kind of a sustainable diet, we see that actually we're coming much closer to something as a reference the Eat Lancet diet recommends. So that means kind of in the categories we are already quite good. But even so, changing to sustainable means that first of all, we do not reach actually the Eat Lancet diet recommendations, but we get better on the diet composition. But still, one of the problems that we still come up with a too high calorie intake. Changing to sustainable food production very often, or one comes to the assumption that maybe we would then massively need to expand actually agriculture area. So what you see here is this is forest area, projected forest area over time, and this is cropland in the current sustainable and this is very sustainable scenario. This line means so the kind of afforestation efforts we have. So you see this constant increase here. So what you see is that you don't see much, and that is actually a good sign between the different scenarios, because it means that actually a change to sustainable food production means no extension of the agricultural area. But what we actually get is in the two sustainable and sustainable plus scenarios, kind of that we'll get new forest areas by 2050. So this is something we gain. When we're looking at our kind of the global footprints means, so the climate impact. So what we're seeing here is now kind of the greenhouse gas emissions that are going to be produced or emitted by the different sectors. Is that so if we could just continue with our with our current trend, we're going to have an increase of the greenhouse gas emissions to 2050. However, if we change to sustainable food production system, the greenhouse gas emissions is going to be increased by kind of by this amount. And even if we go to the very ambitious one, the sustainable one, we're even going to decrease below zero. That means we're going to be from emitting to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Right, there should be actually. So anyway, a change to sustainable food production means that we'll have definitely a significant reduction of the national greenhouse gas emissions. So when we're looking further at global impacts, so coming back to the planetary boundaries means, so currently with the current trend means that so what you see here, this red triangle is the kind of the planetary boundary threshold, is that we're going to stay, definitely we're going to be outside of that. So we are still transgressing the kind of our share of the planetary boundaries, but changing to sustainable pathway means that we're actually going to stay within it, so that we're not transgressing it. So kind of a change to sustainable food production means that we're going to stay within the limits of the per capita share of the planetary boundaries. Now, when it comes to or conversion towards a sustainable food system, means that we need to transform the Nordic food system, and you can do it kind of on different levels. So one could be on the like you can just do some actions that are kind of what we call no regret actions. So these are actions that are easily returnable again. Or you can have something like innovative actions that are more like, use this maybe the same structure, but using them in a new way. Or you can have massive paradigm shifts, which are kind of really transforming the system in it. On what level you do it is very much depends a little bit on the kind of the willingness of the policies of the or the different sectors to change, but also kind of the different sectors of their possibilities to deliver. So because very often the transformation also means that there needs to be stronger or less stronger structural changes included. So what we did is actually, so we started these stakeholder dialogues, which is kind of an iterative process where we actually do something like an explorative phase, and is kind of very much like what we have now. So just with the business as usual, and then the kind of a sustainable pathway shows kind of what is our kind of range of opportunities. But the problem is that in policy, very often it has to be kind of depends on the negotiations between the different sectors or different ministries. You come up with a solution. The other thing is then also, I mean, very often people have very strong assumptions on what things need to be changes, but don't consider kind of consequences maybe that it has on other sectors or on other parts. So what we designed is actually this kind of iterative cycle where we kind of use this implementation, look at them, what would be the outcomes, see what is actually the intention and what is actually the gap that is created, and then kind of reiterate this cycle, kind of come up with new ideas, trying them again. For this, we kind of invited people not only from the government, but also from kind of unions and organizations. And additionally also from the private sector as CEOs of supermarkets or of the food producing industry, but also kind of local chefs. And the whole stakeholder process is structured in a way that we have kind of a pre-meeting where the people get presented the current outcomes we have, or the current assumptions of the scenarios, and then in a workshop we try to kind of gather the ideas and kind of finalize some targets the different stakeholders have, and also capture the rationale behind their decisions. Then we use this simple model, kind of the FABLE tool that Aline already introduced, and see what are actually the outcomes, and then kind of create something like a summary document for that. And then in the workshop, we kind of start and talk over again what are the outcomes and how eventually people reconsider some of the decisions. And this is, as I said, like an iterative process, and is then over and over repeated with different stakeholder groups, but also within different countries. So we're currently running, in January, we're going to run a pilot study in Sweden, but this will also be done in Norway, in Finland, and in Germany. So our way forward is kind of for the modeling. So, I mean, the modeling allows us to investigate the kind of the potential that's there and create these pathway scenarios. And that by this, it kind of provides policy recommendations for dietary and land use changes. And kind of a regional aggregation of outcomes also allows, for example, for the Nordics, means that we can also try to look at what are the aggregated efforts of country unions that are needed for sustainable change. And when it comes, for example, to trade volume or policy efforts, for kind of also kind of get a relevant, or to become relevant on a global level, and to create also a certain leverage on it. So, I mean, this is especially also interesting for like little countries which don't have so much impact on the global level. Then kind of the use of simple models as the FABLE tool is really useful as kind of a to give a fast feedback for stakeholders. And kind of the more complex models allow kind of to find more optimal or feasible ways actually that, or more realistic ones. In the stakeholder dialogues, I mean, they are really necessary kind of for common understanding, but also kind of, so also for this understanding of how scientific decisions are actually made, so to kind of, I don't know, inform kind of inform politics or politicians about it. And also on the other way, kind of also to understand kind of impacts of certain political decisions. And the other thing, I mean, it is definitely useful kind of to find these feasible solutions that are relevant for transformations. I mean, and this can only happen in a dialogue. Okay, and with this, I would like to thank you. And yeah, looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Ingo. I think you addressed some of the questions I see emerging, particularly on stakeholder engagement. I'm going to move quickly over to Mexico now with Charlotte Gonzalez. Charlotte, let's give you 10 minutes, but I'm going to ask that if you could all stay within 10 minutes that we can address some of the questions. But also, because we have a live question and answer format with the Zoom tool, those of you who aren't presenting now, please do go ahead and begin to answer some of those questions. There's a very lively and active chat and question answer that's going on in the Q&A space. Charlotte, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Fabrice. So, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, just click on the presenter mode and we're all set, Charlotte.
There.
Perfect.
I think you can see it now. Perfect. Well, I'm the representative from the Mexican team. We are a large group of scientists and researchers. So what I'm going to be presenting is how we did this process of creating the pathways to sustainable land use and food systems in Mexico. So first, a little bit of telling you how Mexico, what are the challenges and the opportunity areas in Mexico. So Mexico is a highly diverse country, both cultural and biological speaking. So we do have a lot of opportunities to learn and adapt from a wide variety of environments and food production practices. We do have 2 oceans that are surrounding our country. And we have a lot of fisheries, but still the fish consumption in our country is low. 2/3 of the country are drylands. That means that we have very little water to feed our crops in that part of the country, mostly in the northern part of Mexico. And also, that part of Mexico it has a higher GDP. It has not rain-fed agriculture, but irrigation agriculture, and we have industry. So that's very different from the southern part of the country where most of our crops are rain-fed. We have a big problem with agricultural areas. We have about 6 million, which is a little bit less than 1/3 of our total area for agriculture that has been depleted. Some agricultural areas who cannot be used anymore for growing crops. We have, like most of the countries, an unhealthy diets. We have a large proportion of our population overweight, obese, and undernourished. We have some challenges on ensuring consistency in public policy, both horizontally and vertically. That means between sectors, between secretariats, and between the different levels of government, from the federal all the way to the state and the municipality. We have a lack of integrated analysis. For example, we are having problems trying to integrate the areas that deal with food, biodiversity, water, climate change, and on land use, and energy in another side. I think that one of the things that happen across many countries, not only Mexico, there is a lack of quantitative targets related to food and land use systems. And we are part of a United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. It's a commercial agreement that gives us a great opportunity to try to fix things with some of the biggest buyers and emitters of greenhouse gases in the world, but also it creates some problems for us because exporting food is a big industry in Mexico too. So all of these are our challenges and opportunity areas. We can see in every one of them what are the things that we can do better, where we can improve things. So what we started doing when we started with this project is to identify all the institutions responsible for implementing public policy related to land and food systems. So this was mostly easier. However, there are in the current administration, we have some secretariats who are, for example, the Secretariat of Welfare, who is not traditionally responsible for implementing public policy related to land and food systems, but who now is in charge of one of the most ambitious programs for implementing sustainable land and food systems. So the main institutions that we have is the Secretariat of Agriculture and Rural Development, the Secretariat of Health, just because diets are important for the food systems, and the Secretariat of Environment, and several councils and institutions that are under the Secretariat of Environment who deal with forests, with water, with ecology and climate change, with biodiversity and the NBSAP initiative, and with the natural protected areas. So all these institutions are in charge of implementing public policy related. So once that we knew what institutions were important, then we decided to integrate a team of researchers that had specific experience in land and food systems, or that had been government officials in these institutions, or were advisors. For example, the people who is underlined is people who have been in office either as a government official, a high rank of government officials in the environment institutions, or they have been working as advisors of secretariats. So this is really important for us because from here, what we did is to have an idea of how things move in Mexico, how public policy is implemented, a little bit of how public policy is created. Like that's everyone is in every country, there are peculiar things in how public policy is created. But what we did with this is to use our personal connections from our team to start a dialogue with current officials. We started with high-ranking officials. So from a hierarchical level, the third from the top. With that, we established an initial contact. Then we presented in person we presented what we were doing, what was FABLE doing, FABLE Mexico and FABLE, and global FABLE. And after that, it became just an issue of how to explain them, what the process was going to be. So first we sent a concept note. We had interviews, and in November of 2019, we had a workshop and a public launch on FABLE with high-rank government officials. We had, in this workshop, an interaction with them to try to understand what was the state of the land and food systems in Mexico, and also to show them what were the results of our modeling as a way of showcasing what we were able to do. So since then, our communication have been mainly remote, using Skype, presenting our results, the preliminary results of our modeling. And this all became a little bit more complicated after COVID hit our country, because all the country shut down, like most of other countries. And then what we are doing now is getting into the process of generating the stakeholder dialogue, like the Nordic and the UK system. Well, the Nordics showed and the UK system will show. So what we did is, with this information that came out from the workshop, we had two pathways. And what we did is basically use Mexican current policy and international commitments to try to understand what were the trade-offs of implementing them and how much would they contribute to the national and the global goals. So we have current trends, and where we use the historical trends of improvement for maize, wheat, beans, and sorghum, and the same for livestock. We use federal reforestation programs that were like Sembrando Vida, and some ecological reforestation programs instituted by the CONAFOR. We represented the diet, the current diet in Mexico, which is high on ultra-processed foods, fat, sugar, and refined cereals. And we decided the protected areas, because it's Mexico is so close to reach this agreement of 17%, we were going to leave it like that. No more movement in there. However, we created a sustainable pathway that was also a pathway that was possible. And it was possible because we were going to see the trade-offs of current public policy and international commitments. And with that, we used some pilot programs and some experimental programs on sustainable production systems, like Masagro in Mexico, which is a program who has been generated by the government in conjunction with other institutions, and some silvopastoral systems, some modern silvopastoral systems to increase our meat production, basically livestock, beef. Then we started with reforestation program that it was a commitment, a soft commitment from Mexico with 8.4 million hectares for 2050, and a healthy diet, but also a culturally adapted diet for Mexico, which it will include more fruits and veggies, legumes, whole cereals, and less fat and sugar and ultra-processed foods. And finally, we raised the bar into protected areas to 30% to 2050. With this, we generated our results. I'm going to give you just a preliminary results. The model needs to be improved, of course, like always, all the models. So what we created is in the top part, you can see, which is the current trends, which is basically what will happen if we keep going in the way that we are doing. And in the bottom part, you can see what will happen if we change diets and we improve our production systems. So basically, we have a reduction in deforestation, we have a recovery of land, a reduction in pasture, an increase of reforested land. So this all seems very similar. What happens really is that with this, we became a country that instead of changing your land use, your vegetation into pasture lands, what you have is a country where your pasture land becomes carbon sinks. And with that, we are able to reduce 89% of our greenhouse emissions. So in diets, what we did is to create diets that were culturally acceptable and more healthy for people and the environment. So Mexico has a sedentary population with more than 75% of its population living in urban areas, and with 10% of our children stunned, 1.9 wasted, and 16% of our children in school years with a deficiency in vitamin A. But also we have 75% of our Mexican population overweighted and obese, and 9.4 suffer diabetes. That's a huge burden in public health. So there is a need, an important need of changing our on changing our diets. So what we did is to substitute basically the most important parts. We need to eat more fruits and veggies. We need to eat a recommendable amount of eggs. Mexicans, we do love eggs, but 2 eggs or 3 eggs a day is not healthy, is not sustainable for the planet. So we changed that. We lowered the consumption of sugar, but we all did, what we did basically was to improve the diet by diversifying it and lowering the amounts of unhealthy foods. For example, refined sugars, refined cereals, oils and fats, and we increase the consumption of veggies, nuts and seeds, and fruits. So the conclusions and moving forwards. So what we know from our exercise is that the integration of sustainable and agricultural practices might increase productivity without the area increment. And we will have an important reduction in greenhouse gases emissions. We do know that the model is highly sensitive to changes in diet, and we believe that it happens. We still have to work to understand this very well, but we do think that it happened because Mexico uses its land to feed its people. We are not a big exporter of foods. We are in terms of amount of money, but we are not in terms of total production. So most of our production is eaten at home. So whatever happens in the changes in diets is going to reflect really quickly into the land.
Thank you, Charlotte. So, if you can wrap up so we can move on
yes,
to...
this is the last one. This is the last one. So finally, what we need to do is now iterate with SADER on future agricultural sector under alternative scenarios. We need to sponsor with SADER workshops in several locations around the country to basically set up this system of communication with SADER and with the private sector that also is in communication with SADER. We need to continue the engagement with other the government departments. We are working in the subnational work that is implementing this kind of work at subnational level. We are going to start with the state of Jalisco government as a pilot state level analysis, and we are promoting the work with state universities so they can start their own process in their own states. So far, we are working with 3 states. And finally, we need to refine our model, better data and better assumptions for Mexican reality at different scales. And we need to develop Globiome, which is a partial equilibrium model, also is spatially explicit, because this is what it has been asked from us, from the government. With that, I thank you all, and I'll stop sharing.
Muchísimas gracias, Charlotte, para toda esta presentación. So, thank you, Charlotte. And again, a rich conversation in the Q&A that I encourage you all to participate in. Let's move over to the UK with Paula Harrison. Thanks, Paula. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Fabrice. So yeah, I'm going to present the UK experience in developing our FABLE pathways and how we attempted to develop them with different stakeholders in the UK to try and align the work with their policy needs. So just get that to move. Okay, so just to start with some context to the UK, and particularly here in terms of our current policy commitments, both in terms of climate and biodiversity. So we announced a new target of trying to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in June this year, and that's now embedded in law. And actually, very currently, just this morning, our Prime Minister actually announced that there is a new ambition to reduce our emissions over the next 10 years by more than 2/3. And a lot of this real push to show that the UK is increasing its emissions in climate change mitigation is because it wants to be seen as a leader and to set example for other major economies, particularly in the lead up to hosting the next UN climate summit in Glasgow next year. But of course, the UK also has a number of biodiversity strategies, and these also have links in them to both climate change and to the agricultural sector. But actually, there are a few quantified targets within them that we were able to really build into modelling tools. But of course, there is also recognition in the UK that linking both the climate change and the biodiversity agendas is critical. And hopefully this will be pushed forwards into the UN climate COP next year, as well as the COP for the CBD. Critical in providing context for our UK pathways, of course, is Brexit. So this is the UK's exit from the European Union, which will bring about a lot of uncertainty around our future trade environment. But at the same time, it also brings opportunities because we are developing a whole new set of policies. And particularly key to FABLE is the new policies that we're developing for agriculture and the environment. And actually also this year, our Environment Minister announced that we have a new agricultural bill that has passed into the law with the goal of environmental gain. We also have devolved decision-making powers for some aspects of policy, and this applies to both environment and agricultural policy. So it's important to know that this policy is implemented and designed at the scale of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, not at the UK scale. This raises challenges in terms of aligning those policy commitments across the devolved administrations and of course their impact on food and land use systems. And it's really important that they are joined together, not across just devolved administrations, but across policy areas within those devolved administrations. But there is recognition actually in most of those administrations that policies need to take account of direct effects. So what are the effects of UK policy on land use elsewhere in the world, so that we don't develop our policy in isolation with the danger of exporting our footprint to other countries. So this is where FABLE really comes in as being a promising tool that can help to inform some of these issues. So just to go into that in a little bit of more detail, what we've been doing is talking to stakeholders now for about the last 18 months. And we've sort of focused really on policymakers in the government, the UK government and the devolved regions, but also, again, some interaction with our research funding organisations and expert researchers from our learned societies, such as the Royal Society in the UK. So we haven't yet engaged with the private sectors and with farmers. And again, that is not a reflection of a lack of importance, more in terms of just capacity, both in times and resources. And it's something we would want to move on to in the future. So what we've been doing, similar to the Mexico team, we circulated a concept note around key stakeholders we wanted to engage with, first of all, to sort of so that they could start to understand what FABLE was about. And then we held a roundtable forum in October 2019, where we were able to present some preliminary findings from the FABLE modelling tools to sort of showcase what those modelling tools could achieve, and to start some discussions with stakeholders on how FABLE could help to address UK policy needs, and to explore how they would like to collaborate with us over the coming year to try and enhance and extend our analysis. That led to a series of engagements that, because again, we were moving into COVID period here, moved online via email and online workshops, where we circulated iteratively different documents on draft assumptions that would underlie our pathways. And then stakeholders were able to iteratively comment on them. They were also able to suggest key policy documents or data sources that we could use to help inform the selection of suitable parameters underlying those pathways. What also came out from those stakeholder dialogues were a number of priorities that stakeholders identified for enhancing the UK version of the model, some that we were able to implement, but some that were more difficult and went into more long-term planning. We were lucky enough then to have a 1-month secondment into our FABLE team from the UK government's Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs that was able to help us explore some of these priorities going forwards and how we might bring them into future versions of our FABLE modelling work. And of course, again, this is iterative and long term, so we're just at the beginning of the stakeholder engagement process, and it will continue into next year when we will go back to them to present the results of the FABLE modelling in 2020 that is based on the pathways that they have helped us to co-create. So in terms of the pathways and the assumptions behind them, stakeholders were keen for us to do as many pathways as possible. So actually limiting them to 3 was quite difficult, never mind going down to 2. So we did a current trends pathway, which is pretty much based on current policy to represent this sort of lower boundary of feasible action. And we did this sustainable high ambition pathway to see what was really possible with the most ambitious policies that we thought were adoptable within the UK. And then we did an intermediate one as well, so we could see some of the stepping stones that were possible and the sensitivity to those different assumptions within our pathways. All of those assumptions were based on either key government reports that talked about ambitions going forwards. If there was nothing written in reports, they were decided through stakeholder discussions and with expert input where that was needed. So what's summarized in this slide is really just some of the assumptions underlying our high ambition scenario. And again, I won't go through these in detail, but they cover things like moving to a healthy and sustainable diet. We chose to go to the UK government's dietary requirements called an Eat Well diet, because this has been specifically designed to be closer to a UK diet. We also brought in significant increase in tree planting of 50,000 hectares per year. And this is compared to the current trends of 9,000 hectares per year. So for the scale of the UK, that's quite ambitious. Increases in protected areas up to 30%, but that does include some farmland as well. And then we had some interesting discussions on what would be our assumptions for productivity, where stakeholders were keen that we were highly ambitious, but also realistic. And this was where we brought in expert input to ensure we weren't over ambitious in the productivity increases that we were assuming. And then we also had some assumptions around reductions in post-harvest losses, reductions in food waste from household consumptions, how much footprint of the land would be taken up by urban areas, and that climate change would be limited to the 2 degrees Paris Agreement target. Underlying all of the pathways, we had median projections in population that came from our UK Office of National Statistics. And we also had no change in trade. And again, stakeholders thought that this would confuse the picture with the current uncertainty around Brexit, and they preferred to keep the imports and exports at current levels and look at some of the other assumptions underlying the pathways. So quickly, again, just to look at a couple of results, you've seen results for diets from the other countries. So here for the UK, if you look under the current trend scenario, you can see that currently, if we compare it to the Eat Lancet recommendations, we are currently over consuming in sugar, roots, red meat, eggs, and milk. And if you look at the UK average calorie intake, it's actually 32% higher in 2050 than the average minimum dietary energy requirement at the national level. And if we look at moving to our sustainable high ambition scenario, which brings in the Eat Well diet, here we can see that this particular diet has much lower intake of sugar and animal products and higher intake of pulses, fish, fruit, and vegetables. So what we see is that we see a reduction in the consumption of sugar, eggs, red meat, and milk, and they all now fall within recommended range by 2050. We still have a lot of consumption of roots because we love potatoes in the UK. Very difficult to move, I think, the UK from that particular love of potatoes in all forms. And then what does this mean for greenhouse gas emissions? So here under the current trend scenario, which is the solid black line, we achieve still a slight decrease in greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture, forestry and other land use sectors. And that is related to agricultural emissions declining because farmland is being converted to urban areas or being afforested because they are still considered to be priority policy targets. But if we look under the sustainable high ambition scenario, which is the dotted line, again, similar to the Nordic results, here we see a very large reduction of 123% by 2050 compared to current trends. So it's turning net emissions into a net sink. And the key drivers behind that trend is the ambitious dietary change. as well as the productivity improvements, because they reduce both direct emissions from ruminant livestock, but they also free up farmland, and that enables afforestation and regeneration to natural land to allow carbon sequestration. So to conclude, I think what we've seen from exploring these three pathways is that there is quite a dramatic impact of future land use change on biodiversity. So particularly under our current trend scenario, we see that all non-forest natural land, except for that's in protected areas, is lost by 2030, and it's lost to urban development, afforestation, or the expansion of farmland. But if we move to a sustainable pathway, it really illustrates how dietary change and productivity improvements can sort of release land that can then be used for biodiversity and carbon storage, and enabling this transition to a more sustainable food and land use system. And those results sort of highlight those strong dependencies between climate, food and biodiversity targets, and how they are linked to important drivers of dietary change. They also highlight some of the key trade-offs and synergies that are really important for our governments to take into account in sort of the emerging national policies that are currently being developed post-Brexit. So what we're going to be doing from now on is taking these findings back to our stakeholders so that they can see what the assumptions in their pathways revealed in terms of different outcomes. We also know that the stakeholders have already told us they want us ideally to move to subnational modelling and spatial modelling, and there are other various refinements that came up during our discussions in terms of including peatland and biofuels in a better way and refining our land use classes to better reflect sort of woodlands and grasslands in UK systems. But yeah, we hope that by going back to FABLE, to our stakeholders, we can continue exploring things together in an iterative process, and that the stakeholders still recognise what they have in our previous interactions, is that FABLE does help link the UK ambitions to other countries' ambitions, and it also allows this explanation of different trade-offs and challenges in trying to meet multiple goals at the same time. And I will leave it there and say thank you very much for your attention and hand you back to Fabrice.
Thank you so much, all of you. And if the panelists can turn their cameras back on, that would be fantastic. And I think there's a couple things that you saw in those. Is one, in the diverse approaches that the teams took to engage with stakeholders. Mexico very much looking towards a policy-oriented, engaging with policymakers. The UK example, where they built on existing policy plans and brought that into the report. And then the Nordic countries have engaged in a broader stakeholder dialogue. So really, in each country, that there's a diversity of approaches that have been taken. But the other point that Paula made, I think, quite eloquently, is that this is not about produce a report, engage with policy you've done, but the iteration, the repeat engagement, the capacity to listen to policymakers about what a potential plan is, to bring this into the FABLE models, to see what the impacts of a national plan might be, and to use those results to then go back to policy and say, well, so how do we adjust? Is this ambitious enough? Is it not ambitious enough? What are some of the trade-offs that we have to deal with is really a key part of this. And I think that's one of the biggest novelties of FABLE, is moving away from the knowledge to action type of model to really a much more knowledge and action model. Aline, there's several questions that have popped up in the chat that I know that you've been taking a look at them. So I'd like to give you a first stab at some of them. Charlotte, with some questions for you on indigenous diets. And the rest of you on the panel, if you want to take a quick look, if there's a question you want to answer, let me know. But Aline, let's start with you with some reactions to some of the questions that you're seeing in the Q&A format.
Yes, no, I thank you, Fabrice. I'll just answer quickly to Agnès Bocalan. So on the exports question, so we include agricultural exports in our framework, and how it influences the target is that the trade or exports or imports will influence how much land would be required domestically to produce agricultural goods. And then at the end, this land dedicated to agriculture, if it has to expand or if it has to produce with some input, then will affect our different targets, so like the GHG emissions, the biodiversity, and so on. And of course, like there are the initial assumptions from the country teams on trade, but then don't forget that it can be also slightly different at the end after we do this trade harmonization at the global level. So that's for the first question. And maybe I can take a second one very quickly. There was one on Africa, and indeed, I think that it's a very important question. We only have 3 countries from Africa in the consortium currently. So, and that's true, but this is one of the regions where we expect the most drastic change in the food and land systems in the next decades. So, unfortunately, parts of these results are covered now by the rest of the world region, which is then with basic assumptions that we make at our level, at the FABLE Secretariat level. We don't play it with stakeholders. So I think that the main way to make that better in the future would be to expand and to include more countries from Africa in our consortium.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that important Africa question. Charlotte, did you want to talk anything about dietary shifts? There's several questions on dietary shifts. I've seen a couple about whether indigenous diets are part of the solution. What are policies that might move us towards indigenous diets? I mean, I always love the Mexican flag as an example, because I always say that the Mexican flag is actually a representation of healthy diet, right? About 30% greens, about 30% the green part, 30% starches, the white in the middle, 30% fruits, the red on the side, and then moderate amounts of meat, the eagle in the middle, and less than 2% sugars, that snake in the eagle's mouth. So healthy diet is actually on your flag. But what do you say about transitions towards healthy diets and the role of a traditional diet in achieving that target?
Yeah, well, I think it's difficult to say what's a traditional diet in Mexico. We have so much diverse culture. We're so diverse culturally that it's difficult. Northern part relies on fish and meat because that's what is able to get. Because as traditionally we don't have much water. All the water is underground and it's difficult to extract. So until there was oil and able to use machinery, we were unable to really farm those areas. So they rely on meat. There are other areas in Mexico that have a traditional system called the milpa system, where they have a lot of veggies and a lot of quelites, which are some weeds that are edible that sprout out voluntarily in the milpa system, which is basically a system of maize, beans, squashes. I think that there is I don't believe there is a current effort from the Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública, the National Health Institute, to revise the food guides in Mexico. So what they are doing is to looking into the national diet as an average of what we mostly eat, what we should be eating given our level of activity, but also what are the differences within regions. So there are certainly some regions where the interest is to procure that some of those traditional systems prevail and that food is taken into account for cultural reasons. But there are also other places in Mexico where the milpa system doesn't exist and is impossible to exist because there is not a culture of using it. So taking all that into account, they are creating these food guides, which in turn is going to become the guidelines for the food, the basic food basket. And that has a lot of implications of what is going to be produced and what are the public policies who are going to be implemented to promote that food basket is met. So I think that there is work already done in Mexico. One of our team members, Sonia is, she's part of our team, and she's also in this expert team from the government trying to figure out how to improve the food guides for Mexico.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charlotte. And Shyam, just so everyone knows, Shyam has come in because Ingo had another appointment that he knew of. So Shyam is here representing the Nordic countries as part of that Nordic modeling team. And Shyam, I see that you took a stab at one of the questions on organic and local, and I've seen some other questions on agroforestry, agroecology, or conservation in agriculture. This notion of nature positive agriculture is something that's being discussed quite a bit right now. We probably need to separate local, which the model did sort of take care of versus the production practices. But do you want to take a stab at answering how we deal with sustainable production practices in the FABLE teams?
Thank you. In the Swedish case, we are trying to take into account the local productions, but it's of course we assume that the domestic production is the local production for the food self-sufficiency. But at the same time, the organic food production is very important. In the Swedish context, that's why we're trying to segregate between the conventional farming systems and the organic production systems. The way we have been working, but we have not done it. But we are trying to use the FABLE calculator in such a way that we segregate the crops activity, the organic crops and the non-organic crops, and set scenarios that how the organic crops, the scenario defined by the national food strategy, how it affects and the land use, crop land use change and the crop productivity innovation gaps in terms of conventional farming system. That's we are trying to see the trade-off of the organic farming systems and make use of the FABLE calculator so that it can be very useful for the stakeholders to interact on that aspect. That's where I've been working from the Swedish team. Did I answer you?
Yeah, thanks, Shyam. And I know that several of the country teams began to look at, capacity to produce self-sufficient at the national level, dependencies on trade, and some of the more challenging parts of the Semitone were actually the trade adjustments afterwards. And I think some really good discussions as, when does trade become a vehicle by which we don't achieve climate and conservation targets versus when does trade actually become a really interesting tool to achieve those targets. So those are the kinds of trade-offs that the countries were only able to deal with because it was a multi-country exercise. So the gaming part of the Semitone really was, after each country presented their own pathways, what adjustments we make between countries, and then this kind of a competition between countries to see who could make the biggest contribution to the guidelines. But I think some of the integration of the agriculture and nature positive we're not quite there yet in terms of models, but it is something that I know many of the country teams have wanted to spend some time on. There's quite a few questions in the question box about stakeholder engagements, both in terms of how do you ensure that you're dealing with a breadth of stakeholders? How do you make sure that you're not being co-opted by one interest versus another? And how do you envision then that we might be able to continue working with countries, including citizen countries, to build future scenarios? Is that something that any of you would want to take on? And Paul, I see there's a specific question about DEFRA and whether they would take on the results of the FABLE work or similar. So maybe let's start with you and let's see if the others want to follow on in your heels.
So yeah, I mean, so I can start on and maybe start specific with answering that question and then more generalized slightly. So certainly DEFRA were involved as part of our stakeholder engagement going forwards, and they will in the past, and they will be going forwards. And I think the benefits of doing this iteratively is that not only do we learn about the policies that we need to try and represent in our assumptions and how the best way to represent them are, but actually the people from DEFRA and the other policy departments we work with also learn more about the capabilities of the modelling tool, but also the limitations of the modelling tool and how they can use it in their various policy design processes going forwards. And that includes, for example, the NDCs, which are mentioned in the question. So what we would hope as part of that future iterations with stakeholders is that they really consider our results in terms of their long-term development strategies to mid-century as part of the UN FCCC process, but also the potential to increase ambitions and the achievability of their ambitions and the possible outcomes of those ambitions leading up to the 2023 global stock take. And I think it's really key to do this iteratively with stakeholders, because certainly in the UK, again, it's a very active research team. And there's lots of researchers working on land use change, but all coming from different levels, and each of those modelling tools has different unique selling points. So some of them might provide spatial explicit information for particular parts of the UK or for a devolved administration. But I think what's really unique about the FABLE is this linking the UK into this global context and actually understanding the role the UK plays with the rest of the world in collectively increasing ambitions, and the fact that actually one country alone is not sufficient in isolation, and we have to work together to collectively meet those targets, and that there are multiple targets. You can't think just carbon without thinking about biodiversity, other environmental issues and all of that. And I think that is, if we can get that to be recognised, and I think that is already recognised now in government departments. So now they're moving actually to sort of what can we do about it? What are the specific policy designs? So we now have got this new landmark agricultural bill passed into policy and law, which will lead towards environmental gain. But actually just passing that into law is a long way from actually transitioning to implementing it in practice. And there's a 7-year transition period to allow farmers to adapt, to implement that. And again, it's always saying that there is an urgency here, and we realise that there is a transition period needed. Farmers need support, but that implementation shouldn't be weakened in the process of that transition.
That was actually a brilliant statement to close on, Paula. Thank you so much for making it. Charlotte, I know you want to make a quick comment before we close, so I'll give you the microphone before we wrap up. Thank you, Fabrice.
Yeah, but for me, it's very important what Paula said, but there is also an important part that is diversity in our team has been essential to know, not being hijacked for only one type of narrative. So for us, it's been very important that every member of our team, they have a very critical idea of what the foods and land use systems are about, but also that we have a communication with all the other teams in Global FABLE. And that has brought us to think about issues that for us are, or we believe are very important and unique in Mexico. And then we realize that we share more with other countries, challenges and opportunity areas. And with that collaboration, we have been able to really keep us as neutral as possible, to be open to other options. So I think that this collaboration between teams and to have a diverse team in each of the nations is really important.
Thanks, Charlotte. That's great. So everyone, I'd like to thank you all for your participation. I hope it's been an invigorating and useful hour and a half for you. Aline and team, thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you so much for all the hard work that you put into this. Your report just came out yesterday. I'm pasting it in the chat right now in case anyone else wants to get a hold of that. It presents both individual country work as well as the collective work. So we do hope that you find this useful. If you have any questions that we haven't answered or you're interested in engaging, please, by all means, do get a hold of the FABLE secretariats. But again, thanks to all of you and wishing you all a good weekend.